Welcome everybody to the, what are we doing? To Predictive AP on a Stick and Validation Survey Overviews by Samuel Clements, that's me. If you want to know thy fi, you're in the wrong room. You need to be next door talking to Stoney. So I suppose while the last couple people are trickling in, I guess we'll get kicked off with the about me. So the requisite about the presenter slide, CWNE 101, CCIE wireless, good Lord, all sorts of stuff, Meraki master, blah, 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 blah. Probably, I think the ones that I guess are probably more interesting are the blogging and social media aspects. Of course, you heard all the CWNEs up here talking about staying engaged in social media. I think that, you know, obviously I would echo their sentiments. Stay active on Twitter, start a blog, engage people, talk to people. So blog is sc-wifi.com, and on Twitter I'm at Samuel_Clements. Also co-host of a show with Blake, the No Strings Attached show, available on iTunes. I think we're going to be trying to do a recording this evening, so if you guys are interested in either participating or seeing how a podcast is created, would love to have you stop by and chat or at least watch. Also co-host of a show, Whiskey and Wireless, with Ryan Adzema, which I believe we are also going to try and do a recording of. That would be tomorrow night, where we will be, I believe, drinking and talking about wireless. So you're also welcome to come watch how that's made. Mobility practice manager for a large bar. So the reason that's up there is not necessarily because it's what I do for a living, but it's really a general disclaimer about the phrases that I'm going to use, generally speaking, are going to include words like your customer. That doesn't mean necessarily that you have to be selling something. It's simply the mindset that I live in all day long. They can generally be interchanged with, you know, your employer or your environment, you know, anything along those lines. My background tends to be coming from a professional services organization, so my tact is very much from a setting expectations with a customer and then delivering those expectations. So I understand not everybody is a VAR. Some people work for vendors, some people work for enterprise. Just understand that that's the phrasing that I use where I come from. You can use those terms interchangeably. Obviously contribute to the Cisco partner community. Early field trial participant, test writer for well-known professional level wireless tests and wireless SME. There you have it. So that's about me. And today we're here to talk about surveys, about overviews of the different types of surveys. So, you know, there's a lot of things to talk about, especially when you're sort of level setting a broad audience as far as what you should and shouldn't do, or can and can't do, or how you even differentiate between them. But I think that well, so let's not even go there first. Survey overviews. Did somebody else write these slides? Survey overviews. A survey is a great word. It's a terrible word. It's been redefined so many different times by so many different people, and it stands for so many different things. Merriam-Webster defines it as to ask many people a question or a series of questions in order to gather information about what most people do or think about something. I like that definition. It's a good definition. To look at and examine all parts of something. We use the word survey to cover all manner of sins, right? Anybody use the word survey wrong, ever? Anybody ever use the word right? Do we know? It's a good question. To measure and examine an area of land. Surveyors, right? Land surveyors. In technology, we have a couple of different ways that we can use the word survey. Data center guys use it to assess cooling and spatial needs. Right, your data center guys walk into a data center and they do a data center survey. Your voice guys, I'm going to survey my end users, find out what DIDs they use, find out how they use their phones, how about inbound, outbound calls. Route switch guys do surveys, right? What's in your MDF IDFs? What areas of the facility they service? How many drops runs? How many needs? How many connections do you need? Do you need PoE? Oh, and by the way, some wireless guys do some survey stuff too, right? So the term survey is again an awful term we use to cover all manner of sins. But I guess I'd like to sort of start by level setting everybody in the room with really just one simple question. I think a common ground is very, very imperative. I think the simple question: Do we need wireless surveys?
Yes.
Anyway?
Yes.
No. No. Of course we don't need wireless surveys. We couldn't be doing a bigger disservice to our target audience than blindly advocating, yes, you must have a survey. With all of the definitions of a wireless survey that are out and available today, we're compounding that problem by saying and advocating blindly, yes, customer, you need a survey. Blindly advocating design can lead to increased cost to the organization, potential dissatisfaction, overinflated sense of service's importance. Anybody run across that? I'm going to charge you, $200,000 to do your survey. Really? That's a lot of money. Wireless deployments that don't meet a given need. Most importantly, confusion and self-entitled customers. Anybody walked into a customer or a site and you say, show me your survey. And they go, here's my survey. And it's a heat map out of WCS. Have you ever run across a more self-entitled customer? Oh, I don't need to pay for a survey. They gave me a survey. Here it is. We just make the problem worse 9 times out of 10 by walking blindly into a customer and saying, you must have a site survey. Case studies. Here's some contrived examples to prove my point. Healthcare. That's a chip shot, right? Healthcare, healthcare really needs a site survey, right? So I'm going to talk about a hospice care organization. Hospice care, they need a site survey. It's important, right? Wireless is important. Organization needs connectivity for field nurses and wants a solution to be taken to patients' home to provide localized coverage. Really, there's a really good example of a healthcare vertical where you might assume, based on their vertical needs, you can wholesale state, yes, you need a survey of some way, shape, or form, yet there's no way in hell you're going to go out to every single customer's home and, excuse me, I'm going to hang an AP and I'm going to step click and I'm going to measure. No, of course not. Of course not. Highly distributed environments, right? Customer education is a key to a success in a situation like this. And again, we're just sort of level setting, finding some common ground here. Okay, Sam, that's great. That's great. I get it. Highly distributed, hard to do site surveys for. Well, what about retail? Nationwide coffee chain. Oh, that's the other end of the spectrum. They probably don't need a survey, right? It's probably a pretty logical conclusion to come to. Well, what about when that nationwide coffee chain is expanding their corporate headquarters to a new 100,000 square foot facility and they want to go all wireless? Well, so there's 2 really good examples of assumptions that far too many wireless LAN professionals make about that stupid word survey, and they use it wrong. Everybody with me so far? All right. So when you have these conversations about what it is you're doing and the sites you're working on and the verticals you're working in or your particular customer environment, we all have to make assumptions, right? You guys made a couple of assumptions when I said, do you need surveys? Yeah, no, of course we don't, right? We made some assumptions when I said healthcare. Well, yeah, maybe you do need healthcare. Maybe you do need a survey for healthcare. Retail, maybe you don't need a survey. It's okay to make those assumptions. It's okay to even advocate something wrong as long as you're actively documenting that and leaving it behind for the next person. So that when your customer says, yeah, here's my site survey and it's a prime infrastructure heat map that's garbage, you can point to the disclaimer on the bottom and say, oh, by the way, see where that says, don't actually put your APs here? Make those assumptions. They're okay to make. But when you make those assumptions, you must document those assumptions about what it is you're doing. In short, look, I just said that. You, the wireless LAN professional, must start with your user or customer requirements prior to doing any design work. Sometimes that requires a survey, sometimes it doesn't. We like to think that most of the times it does, right? But you cannot assume that everybody everywhere needs some definition of a survey. If you don't have a complete understanding of the requirements, the infrastructure, how can you advocate a site survey, much less a particular type of site survey? Right? Within the site survey family, we have all these various different types of site surveys that we can do. If you don't have a common ground that you've established with your customer, what makes you think that you can actually get to the point of figuring out which type of site survey you need? You can't even get that far, right? And far too many of us, I think, sort of blindly wholesale advocate the word survey. And again, I think we're sort of doing ourselves a disservice. Different verticals, customers, user environments, applications, client devices, needs, mandate different design efforts. And the catch-all assumption that a site survey is required further feeds the confusion about what types of surveys a given design needs. Let's see what the next slide is. It's very, very important for us to start a conversation with the customer about what they need. You must always have that common ground, and you must always start there. Mapping a customer needs to a services engagement, a site survey, or not, and then documenting those needs, I think, is incredibly, incredibly important. So, mapping a customer needs. Site surveys are, oh, I think I even wrote this one. Site surveys, by definition, are the process through which a wireless LAN professional maps a customer's stated and documented wireless requirements to an RF design that, within an agreed upon tolerance level, functions when a customer requires it to. That's my definition of doing a site survey. Is it a good one? Maybe, maybe not. Yeah. No, I got a no over here. Dissenting opinion.
Well, yeah, to me, it sounds like maybe there's a confusion. Well,
do we have the pink box? Can we get the box? Somebody? Anybody? Thanks, Stuart. You got a pink box coming your way. Heads up.
Here, somebody got it. I'll put a coffee here. Just so I'm clear, this is not specifying the design in the site survey. It's just search surveying, data gathering. You're not doing the design here, right?
What I'm doing here is simply making a definition about the word survey, right? And so I guess what I did was I tried to demonstrate that there is at least a little bit of confusion in the market as far as what that term means to a variety of different people. And that's really my definition. When I take a step back and I have a customer say, hey, okay, tell me about this survey thing, if they don't have any preconceived notions, right? My starting point is always taking a customer needs and mapping it to a final solution, and then the survey is the piece in between that builds the RF plan. Stated differently, the RF design needs to do what the customer told you they wanted it to do when they wanted you to do it. Is that maybe stated a little bit better? Or no, am I just like way off base?
No, yeah.
Oh, okay.
No, right. I'm not an authority here, mate.
That seem reasonable to everybody? You have to start with what a customer is expecting to do before you can do anything. Arguably more difficult than where does an AP go, right? Arguably one of the hardest parts of our job is accurately gathering requirements, mapping those requirements to RF speak, cell edges, things along those lines, accurately documenting those requirements so that you can come back to that customer later on in a full feedback loop and you can say, did we meet those requirements or did we not meet those requirements? Yes, okay, all right, got a couple of them back there. Yes? So, your pink box? Oh, 2/3 shot, good job.
So in talking about gathering requirements, what I usually bring it back to is saying it's not even just the particular technical requirements that you're mapping it to, you're also mapping it to the business requirements of the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Chris raises a very good point, which is you're not sometimes even mapping technical requirements, you're rather regularly mapping business requirements about what it is you expect that infrastructure to do. It's not necessarily always RF, right? Cell edges and signal strength and noise floor and density and capacity. Although a lot of those things will carry over, yeah, absolutely business requirements are 100% important. Types of deployment surveys. It took me like 3 hours to build this slide because I don't do PowerPoint. I like to break, when we talk about subdividing site surveys, I like to break up the way I describe site surveys into pre-deployment and post-deployment, on-site and off-site. It gives me a nice square quadrant. Pre-deployment is anything prior to hanging an AP. Post-deployment is anything after hanging an AP. On-site is anything that's done on-site. Off-site is anything that's done off-site. So in my book, we can sort of chunk surveys up into these broad 4 categories, and we'll talk about all of them individually. But pre-deployment off-site surveys generally fall in the predictive analysis or planning style of designs. Pre-deployment on-site tends to be AP on a stick, association-based, passive-based, active designs, called a lot of different things. At the end of the day, though, where I draw the line is, are you on-site taking measurements, or are you off-site taking measurements? Post-deployment, association-based passive surveys, metric testing, this is where you're doing, hey, the network's up and running in its final design, I'm going to go back through and I'm going to validate something. Off-site post-deployment surveys. Anybody ever done one of those? Anybody ever looked at a controller and said, my power level's all tanked? No? Yes? Yeah. You did an off-site post-deployment survey. You gathered metrics about that design off-site, and that's effectively what a survey is. Anybody ever looked at WC or a prime infrastructure heat map or an airwave, thanks, heat map, and said, it looks like I got some gaps there. That's an off-site post-deployment survey. It's a very valid way of gathering data in some instances. Well, not a lot of people consider that a survey, though, but in this context, I think it's very, very important to understand that there are a lot of ways to survey and gather information about your client's wireless infrastructure. On the scale of easy to hard, I think as you move to on-site, your level of effort to do a good job goes up. I think it's hard to do things on-site. It's easy to do things remotely. Fair? Fair, yeah. Oh, and by the way, there's this thing called hybrid, right? How many people we're going to ask? We do have some folks who like to use the term hybrid to, well, we'll talk about that here in a little bit. I just didn't want to make sure that anybody forgot it. The way I generally see these things work is in this sort of a horseshoe fashion. For most customers, it typically starts with some sort of an off-site design that typically bleeds to some sort of an on-site design that leads to the deployment, that leads to some sort of an on-site testing, that bleeds to some sort of an NMS-based systems view overview of the wireless infrastructure. Good? The most important piece to this slide, I think, is this. The level of effort spent prior to doing the deployment is inversely proportional to the level of effort required post-deployment. Stated different, or I'll just say it again. If you spend more time pre-deployment on your design, generally speaking, that manifests itself in less time post-deployment. If you spend less time up front, you generally spend more time post-deployment. There's a balance. And I think that finding that balance is probably the hardest thing that we as wireless LAN professionals have to deal with aside from gathering customer requirements. Fair? Anybody bored yet? No? Okay. One of you? No? Oh, okay. All right. Oh, is it fair? Are you bored yet? No? Okay. Predictive surveys. We're going to talk about each of these sort of one by one. Anybody have a customer say, give me a rough idea what my wireless network's going to cost? Yeah, of course, all the time. Yeah, absolutely. How many APs? Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, it's a very, very important piece to doing our job at properly setting expectations up front, especially as it pertains to cost, right? Predictive surveys are just that, a prediction. Yeah. Give me a crystal ball. I'll look into it. They're deceptively easy to do. They're very easy to get wrong. Anybody ever done a predictive survey wrong? Bad. Anybody ever given an inaccurate number to a customer? Yeah, of course. Predictive surveys are just that. They're a prediction. You should expect a margin of error when you're doing a predictive survey, or for it not to be perfect, I guess is a different way of stating that. Yeah, absolutely. I think that when we talk about when we commonly use predictive surveys, the be-all end-all stopping point of just the term predictive survey needs to be estimation of a pre-deployment bill of materials. And I think that that estimation of a pre-deployment bill of materials is an incredibly important topic for us to stress to our customers, to our end users, to the people who we're building our wireless infrastructure for. Anybody disagree? No? Yeah. Chris disagrees. He's got the box.
I was just going to say as well, I've been in quite a few situations with very distributed companies that don't want to pay for a guy to go to all of their, say, warehouse sites and do surveys of their warehouses. And they're basically, from a financial point of view, said, we only want to do predictives.
Yeah, so the point he made was, in many times in a highly distributed enterprise, the cost is too burdensome for folks, especially in warehousing environments, to shoulder having to send people on site to go do a real good predictive survey. That's okay. That's okay. You should never position to an end user or a customer an accurate representation of what the RF will look like. I think that's probably a very, very, very key important. And that's probably one of the most common things that I guess I battle or that I bump up against on a weekly basis. As a customer goes, hey, they gave me this, and this is what it should look like. Why is this wrong? Why isn't this working? And resetting those expectations about that sort of horseshoe approach, offsite, onsite, empirical measurement. Pre-deployment on-site surveys. Tell me where my APs are supposed to go, or need to go, I suppose. And I think that this is probably one of the most important, compelling nuggets about doing an on-site survey, is empirical gathering of data. Gathering data that you can back up, gathering data that you can click on a button and you can read a value and you can save that value and you can regurgitate that value back to somebody else. Gathering it in an empirical fashion from a scientific perspective, right? I want to make sure that the data that I'm gathering is accurate so that I can use that to make decisions in the future. If you're going to be on site, you may as well stop guessing, right? Don't do a predictive survey on site within some compliance. If you're going to be on site, if you're going to be doing the heavy lifting, gather that data in as honest of a fashion as you can and use that data in your design. The more accurate your customer needs this to be, the harder it's going to be to do. Meaning if your customers expect something to be right the first time, you're going to spend a whole lot of time doing this. If your customers don't care, you could probably get away with not doing a whole lot of effort here, right? Doing some sampling, that's what we'll talk about hybrids here in just a little bit. But as your customer requirements go up from a reliability perspective, from an operational perspective, from it needs to be right the first time perspective, the level of effort spent on site doing your site surveys goes up, sometimes exponentially. It's not uncommon for customers that want it right the first time. Anybody ever had a customer say, hey, when this thing goes in, it really needs to work. I can't have moves, adds, and changes afterwards. Not every customer. Not every customer by a long shot, but there are a good number of customers that do have a requirement of having, 2% moves, adds, and changes afterwards, right? Healthcare, manufacturing, entertainment verticals in particular find great value in not having to move APs, relocate cables, open ceiling tiles, repaint, etc. Not for everybody. Do you walk into an enterprise office space that's wide open, exposed, and it got cables running all over the place, and say, you need to do an AP on a stick survey, and I'm going to step click gather metrics out of every single corner of your office? No, maybe not. Maybe not. It's probably overkill. You walk into a healthcare that's got asbestos in the ceiling, or needs to tent, or says you get one shot at being on site. It's got to be right. I don't care what it costs. All of those things get rolled into doing an on-site survey. Empirical gathering of data to support those customer requirements. It's always a balance of level of effort, interruption that your client can tolerate up front, and the level of effort, interruption your client can tolerate post-deployment. Always, 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 always. If your customers say, I don't want you to be interrupting my patients, I don't want you to be interrupting my employees when you're doing your survey. I understand you're going to be step clicking around, you're going to be in everybody's way. I don't want you to do that. Well, there's a balance. Okay, I won't do it up front. I'm going to do it afterwards. You need to educate that customer that it's always a balance of pre-deployment and post-deployment level of effort. Always, always, always. The hybrid survey. Told you we'd get back to it. How are we doing on time? When am I over? 10:30? 11:30? Okay, cool. Hybrid surveys blends empirical data with a crystal ball to fabricate RF design. All right, you've gone on site, you've gathered some data, you have measured some walls, you've created a very zen feeling for how you feel about the environment, and you like the environment, it feels really good, and so you're going to go, this is what I think it needs to be. Does that work? Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes not. All right, that's the point of guessing. Some people are good at it, some people aren't good at it. Typical customers who are tolerant of moves, adds, and changes, small education, enterprise, retail. There's a whole bunch of customers where this sort of a hybrid approach to doing your RF design is perfectly valid. It depends very heavily on the skill set of the engineer doing the hybrid design and how accurate they were with their measurements up front, and then really how good they were at guessing. How good they were at feeding a program to say, this is what your RF is going to look like. Ekahau guys, AirMagnet guys, they do a great job at trying to be reasonable about RF planning. You can shoot yourself in your foot very, very easily using a planning application. Very, very, very easily. And they're just as deceptive to get wrong or to get right and wrong as a predictive survey is. Just because you've gone on site and gathered metrics, it certainly helps your chance, but you certainly have to know what it is you're doing. You'll commonly find hybrid advocates stressing the importance of post-installation validations due to the imprecise nature of sample and guess. This is my soapbox, so I get to say this, right? This isn't right for everybody. You will typically find the folks who beat the drums loudest about doing post-deployment site surveys. And again, in my book, there's a whole section of post-deployment surveys, right? The folks that stress that you have to go back and validate to some level tend to be the folks that advocate hybrid design. And again, I'm painting some broad brushstrokes here, but there you have it. Guard against customers who commonly misinterpret the on-site presence as an assumption that all data for the design has been empirically measured. Ever been to a customer and it's a 500,000 square foot enterprise environment, and they go, show me your site survey, and they go, here you go, the guy was out here for 4 hours and did this. It's got to be right. Anybody? No? Yeah, one or two? Yeah. Setting those expectations back to the customer. Yes, I'm on site. Yes, I'm gathering some data. Yes, it's probably going to be more accurate than 100% predictive survey. It's not going to be 100% correct. You must make sure that when you're talking about these things to your customers that, that you're setting those expectations correctly. I think it's probably, again, one of the hardest things that we do. Post-deployment on-site survey. Is it working the way I told you it should? These get lumped into post-installation, right? APs are hanging in the ceiling, right? So we go back through and we validate a variety of metrics. Metrics that you can validate during a post-deployment survey, anybody? All sorts of stuff. It's a variety of things that you can measure on site. Gathering those stats, again, post-deployment, typically in an empirical fashion, when you're doing your post-deployment validation and you're talking to your customer about, when I told you I needed a wireless infrastructure, it needed to do X, Y, and Z. You need to map those X, Y, and Z things to metrics that you can measure. Sometimes those are RF specific, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're business needs, sometimes they're throughput, sometimes they're roaming, sometimes they're can I fit 100 people onto this access point? There are a variety of things that you can measure post-deployment, and they don't necessarily all require a site survey application. They don't all require you to step click. that's probably the point that I think is probably most important here, is that we're locked into this term survey, and we all want to go buy, Air Magnet Survey Pro, we all want to go buy Ekahau or Tamasoft, or, pick your poison, right? And we want to rely on that application as the be-all, end-all tool for everything that we do wireless design. And in reality, it ends up being a crutch for most people. The tool is a very small piece of what it is that we actually do. You can do passive association runtime. You can gather those stats a variety of different ways. You can associate to an AP, you can send traffic to the AP, you can do throughput testing, you can do passive gathering of beacons, and you can paint heat maps, and you can do all sorts of stuff post-deployment. The point is that what's right for one customer is not necessarily right for every customer. Hey, looky there. Every post-deployment on-site survey should be tailored to the specific requirements stated prior to the RF design. Deviations from stated requirements should warrant starting over if functionally different. Anybody get halfway through a survey or an RF design and customer goes, oh yeah, I know I told you it needed to support iPads, but now I need to put 725 phones on it. This will work, right? Nobody? Yeah, nobody? Yeah, customers change mid-stride? We've got to be very, very, very cautious about documenting those requirements up front and continuing to work based on those documented requirements. Use those as a baseline for everything you do, including your RF design and your validation, whatever form that takes. Agree to those things and stick to them. Level of effort post-deployment is inversely proportional to the level of effort put into the design pre-deployment. I guess that's something like that, similar a couple slides back, right? The more work you do up front designing and implementing and getting it right the first time, generally speaking, means that you don't have to do quite as much in the validation side of the face. If you do it the other way around, right, if you do 100% predictive design, you really need to do more on the validation side of the house to make sure you got it right. Don't go to a customer and say, yeah, I'm going to do one speed test from an AP and that's going to be fine because I predicted out your wireless infrastructure. Anybody heard anybody say that before? Anybody seen a deliverable claim something like that? Yeah, wireless is fine. I fed it into prime infrastructure. I got some bubbles, and I ran a speed test. You're good. Yeah, don't do that. That's bad. Wait, I need another survey. I need another survey? Really? Well, weren't you guys here a little bit ago? Didn't you guys already do a survey? Now you're telling me you got to come back and do another survey? What was wrong with the first one you did? Anybody? Yeah? Anybody ever heard that? Yeah? A couple people? It's very common to see a post-deployment survey measured in X value and Y% of areas, especially when you talk about RF specific. You talk about a customer who says, okay, I get it up front. You want to come and you want to step click and you want to measure every square foot of my hospital. I understand it's a heavy level of effort. You really got to do all that again when you come back out? No, probably not. Right? If you gather enough data empirically up front to warrant doing your RF design based on a particular way, generally speaking, you have a customer that comes back and says, okay, I get it. I trust that you've done a whole lot of work. Maybe you only need to validate, whatever RSSI value or whatever metric it is you want. You need to validate that I get 54 megs of throughput out to the internet in 80% of all areas. I need you to validate that my SNR is X in 60% of all areas. The more you do up front, generally speaking, the less stringent those requirements can be on the back end. The less you do up front, the more stringent they have to be, right? You do 100% predictive design, you probably need to be everywhere in that facility if the customer's needs warrant an infrastructure that's actually going to support their applications. Else, how are you going to know? You're simply not. Determine up front how the customer is going to judge the overall success of your wireless deployment. Use that as your basis for validation. Start with the requirements. Start with what applications do you need? What are your business needs? What are your fill in the blanks? You tell me, Mr. Customer, about what it is that is going to make this ultimately a success. Agree to that up front before you do step one. Document it, please. Dear God, document it. Leave it for the next person. So that when the next person comes in to fix that design from that other partner who did a crappy job, you can read out of the deliverable, oh, well, they said you agreed to do this, you agreed to do this, and oh, by the way, they did the X, Y, and Z, and it met these requirements. Have you ever had to go in and fix somebody else's wireless infrastructure because they did a terrible job? The people that did a terrible job, did they get thrown under the bus? No, never. I throw people under the bus all the time. I say, okay, we got this terrible environment. Who did the design? Show me their deliverables. Show me the assumptions they made. Show me how they validated that their design met these requirements. Customers, huh? It's a blank look, right? They just don't get it, right? They just don't understand that there's more to setting up an AP and taking some measurements and generating a pretty picture. Everybody agree that there is more to it than just setting up, painting a pretty picture? Yeah. It can sometimes be just as cumbersome as a pre-deployment site survey if you advocate 100% validation. And unless corners were cut on the design, 100% validation is likely not necessary. Right? If you do a hospital and the customer goes, cool, I'm good with this, I need you to go validate 100% of my deployed area. That can be just as difficult as doing the pre-deployment stuff up front. Absolutely can be. If you didn't cut corners with your design, is that really, really necessary? I would say no. Anybody disagree? Okay. Whew. What about cost? Have you ever said, man, this thing's expensive. Can you just sell me the program? I'll do it myself. Nobody? Nobody? Total cost of design tends to be very, very comparable between predictive design and heavy measure and adjust, meaning light design up front, heavy retrofit on the back end, hybrid design and medium measure and test, measure and adjust, and AP on a stick design and light measure and adjust. When I do a cost analysis, at least for the customers that I talk to, I tend to find that overall total cost of design for a customer that's done a correct front to back design tends to be fairly similar, if regardless of the approach. It just matters about where you balance that work at. And I'm talking about moves, edge changes, cable runs, moving ceiling tiles, interrupting people, poor customer dissatisfaction. I think that when you position to a customer that, hey, all of these things are probably going to come out reasonably similar in the wash from a cost perspective, maybe we ought to try and do it right up front. That way we save ourselves the black eye on the back end. Anybody disagree? Really, I thought I'd get more disagreements on that one. Pink box.
Well, I just want to say, I love you have adjust on everyone.
The which one?
You have adjust on everyone.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. It's really hard to do a zero adjust. It's possible, but it's really hard. Pink box.
Yeah, okay. So I would disagree, and I think that the total cost to the customer through lost business or lost productivity is higher if you just do a predictive and then measure and adjust. I think, you know, the costs that you can measure, you're probably correct, but I think that there's some externalities that, you know, they're losing productivity or something. They have the wireless need that otherwise they wouldn't be consulting with you, right?
So you're saying option number one tends to actually be a higher cost overall? Yeah, that's probably fair. I was trying to be polite. I was trying not to, you know, not to weight it too terribly heavily in one direction or another. There is absolutely some compelling cost savings to doing a predictive design. And really, if a customer is okay taking a black eye, if a customer is okay doing a hotspot deployment or a best effort deployment, and you document that as a requirement, so that when the customer comes back to you and says, man, I got all these users bitching at me, you can go, hey, you said right here that was okay. We're going to go do some adjusting, right? Yeah. There can be some compelling cost differences, some compelling cost savings to doing a predictive only design. Yeah, I tend to think that in the wash, you're right, it probably does come out a touch higher, but. Educate your customer the total cost of performing a complete design, including cabling infrastructure, and most importantly, customer satisfaction and perception about how well they're doing their job. It's not just about, are the end users bitching at me because they can't stay connected, right? Somebody somewhere owns that wireless infrastructure, and I would wager that 9 times out of 10, it's not the person sitting in this room. There are some enterprise examples of that, but especially in the partner space or especially in the vendor space, you're working with somebody whose end users are perceiving that person as doing a good job or a bad job. Explain that to that person. When we go do this design, it's not just your end users who are dissatisfied. No, by the way, on top of that, they also think that you did a bad job. I get to walk away from the design when I'm done, all right? I get to say, I wrote all this down and you signed it, and there you go, nanner, nanner. Educate that customer about the risks that they're going to undertake by creating a poor environment for their end users to operate in. Am I doing all right, Keith? That'd be a no. All right. I've only got like 50 more. No, I'm kidding. Document the choices along the way. Document, 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 document. Document and leave behind. Document and put it on the internet. Document and send it to everybody. Customers are going to be very reluctant to give you data that proves that they did something wrong. Say it loud, say it proud. No? Sorry. Document along the way, right? Reinforce in your deliverable. This was the agreed upon metric. Reinforce in everything that you do. This was what was agreed upon, and this is what we're doing in order to deliver a quality solution to our quality network, to our users. Post-deployment offsite surveys. You want access to my what? Sir, yes, pink box in the back.
What you've been talking about all along with getting the customer to say what they want, document what it's going to be, is something that I'm a big proponent of, which is the stakeholders meeting that you have before one survey is done, before one cable is pulled. Yeah. All you have is blueprints and people.
Yep.
And the idea is that all the people in the room are involved with it. In healthcare, that could be a nurse,
sure,
a head nurse, as well as the doctors, as well as the IT people.
Yeah,
and I completely agree with what you're saying. It is absolutely vital that
sure,
you have that stakeholders meeting and everybody agrees on what's going to be done and what the infrastructure is going to do after it's done.
We as wireless LAN professionals get really, really good at sticking our fingers up people's noses and dragging them to a conclusion. Right? And it's painful. And if you don't do that, that also is okay, by the way. It's okay to not do those things, but you must document your assumptions, right? You must say, there was nobody available for your stakeholders meeting. There was nobody available to do this. Therefore, we designed on this. Therefore, we made this assumption. End user or IT director couldn't give you a particular metric. Therefore, these are the values we used. It's okay to guess. It's absolutely okay to guess. It's not okay to guess and keep it locked in here. Guess and write it down. So that when somebody comes back to you and say, well, why did you do this? You can say, I didn't have any data, so I had to guess. I had a meeting with this person on this day. They said, I don't know. Therefore, these are the values I used. That's entirely okay in my book. Post-deployment offsite surveys. This is one that I think a lot of people lose sight of. A, their importance. B, their pervasiveness. I think everybody as a wireless LAN professional does this, and they probably don't know they're doing it. It can be safe to leverage infrastructure metrics post-implementation as a checksum for a proper RF deployment. It can be safe for you to look in your controller and go, hey, all my APs are at power level 3, 4. That's cool, because when I surveyed, my survey APs were set at 25 milliwatts. I can map those two values together. That's a good checksum. It is very, very safe to do that. And anybody ever done that, by the way? There's a handful of people, right? It can be safe to do that. It can be safe to prove to your customer, I did a design and it yielded these values, and these values match my existing design. Correct values are good. Incorrect values are bad. Nothing more, nothing less. You can determine nothing else in my book from a post-deployment offsite survey other than checksum good, checksum bad. If your values in your controller or whatever infrastructure piece of equipment you're looking at says all your APs are running at 100 milliwatts, and your design is centered around an AP that you determined 25, 12, 6 milliwatts, whatever. If they're wildly different, you can say nothing other than I failed. My infrastructure did not settle the way I did my RF design, and I see that in my infrastructure design. Therefore, I did something wrong. Period, end of story. You did use power levels in your design, didn't you? Make sure that's actually what comes out in your deployment. Somebody somewhere mapped your business requirements, or hopefully you, mapped your business requirements to a cell size, to a particular configuration, to a something that you surveyed, to a model of AP, to a power level, to an antenna, to a whatever that drew a cell on a picture, right? You determined how that cell was built. Make sure that you go back after the deployment and make sure that it's actually settled at that power level. Else you're delivering something that doesn't represent what you designed. Don't tune your network to make your checksum correct, right? Don't go into your controller and say, oh, I'm expecting power level 3s and 4s, but they're all 8s. So I'm going to turn the knob and I'm going to let them turn their power up. Anybody ever seen anybody do that? Yeah, it's one of the worst things you can possibly do. If you don't understand how your infrastructure works, how your infrastructure settles your access points, how can you take a site survey, one of those various ways of doing a site survey, and say it's going to come out like this? You can't. Don't use your checksum as a tool for correcting a bad infrastructure. If you survey at power level X, your network should settle at or near that power level. If it doesn't, you designed wrong, try again. Something went bad. I hate to take a hard line in the sand on that, but that's my stance. Too many people go, oh, my power levels aren't correct. I'm just going to make my power levels correct. It's not about power levels. It's about matching what settles runtime with what you designed pre-deployment. Please, pink box. Bring it forward. Come on, give it a throw. There you go. Oh, close enough.
So how is that different from troubleshooting?
Oh, it's not. It's not. It's absolutely a part of.
Because usually in practice, you don't actually wind up doing that unless somebody says, "Hey, this isn't working."
Oh,
and then
well,
you've got to dig in and figure out why it's not working the way it was designed.
I mean, I think it varies, right? I think that there's definitely a camp of people that go, "Hey, when I do an RF design, how do I know I did a good job aside from going and doing some step clicks and some post validations? And 50% of my areas met this metric 80% of the time, right?" Most folks by general nature are curious beasts, and I think that a lot of folks will click on the tab and say, oh, I like to see this settle out this way. And if they don't, I think more people need to, because it's really, really light effort, right? It tends to be very, very easy from a burden perspective to ask somebody to log into their controller, hey, log in and show me that page. I just want to check something right quick. And if you're not doing that, how do you know that your RF is settling from a cell size perspective in some sort of a wholesale checksum fashion?
Well, usually I only get the negative feedback. Right?
I do. Well,
so if the network's working, I don't hear about it. If the network's not working, I hear about it all day long.
Pink box to the man. No, this one. Yeah. Oh, man down. And Keith, I can repeat the question.
What? You're going to guess my question?
Or you,
I was going to say it 5 minutes, but
Okay.
I do also have a question.
yeah.
By the way, love it. Fantastic information. How do you, in your AP on a stick technique, measure co-channel interference when you only have a couple of APs? And that's what I find is the most difficult metric to design around and to measure against. And my question is, what's your technique for measuring that during an AP on a stick?
Yeah, it's difficult. So the question is, how do you measure, for example, things like co-channel interference when you're doing an AP on a stick survey, especially if we've only got one AP, right? Can we table that for just a couple of slides? Because if I can get to the end, then that's a really good one to finish off on. Okay. A word about tools. Survey is expensive. Just tell me how much the program is, and I'll do it myself. Be careful about letting your tools mislead you. Please be careful about letting your tools mislead you. Just because you can paint a map green doesn't mean you should. Doesn't mean it's accurate. Be careful about letting your tools mislead your customers. Almost as important. Yeah. Understand your provided solution works just because, understand how your provided solution works. Just because you can design for vendor A does not necessarily mean you can design for vendor C. And we'll talk about that here in just a few moments. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. Remember, it's easy to paint a map green. That doesn't mean it'll actually work.
Wi-Fi Hulk.
What's that?
Wi-Fi Hulk.
Wi-Fi Hulk says it does. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. My most favorite quote in the whole wide world. It's like, give a man a Les Paul guitar and he becomes Eric Clapton. It's just not true. Roger Waters said that, by the way. I'm not sure if that can make it into the final slide. I didn't put use with permission, but you know, I guess it's on the video. Closing words on responsibilities, and then we'll get to Keith's question. You are the wireless LAN professional. It is incumbent upon you to understand the customer needs, educate the customer about reality versus hype, not mislead the customer with unrealistic expectations. Agree upon success metrics with your customer prior to start. Document the design, document the implementation, document the validation. Don't let yourself get thrown under the bus by the guy who's going to come down the road 2 years from now and say, oh, that idiot did this all wrong. Understand your craft. Validate to yourself that you understand your craft. Validate to your employer that you understand your craft. Validate to your customer that you understand your craft. Keith, you asked a question about doing AP on a stick survey and measuring co-channel interference. There is, in my book, when we talk about doing an AP on a stick design, I think that it's very, very important to understand how your manufacturer's auto RF algorithms will ultimately settle a wireless infrastructure. And a variety of different manufacturers do it a variety of different ways. And so just because Cisco uses neighbors at a particular default value doesn't mean that Aruba is going to use those same default values. Those neighbor messages can sometimes take into account RSSI or SNR or interference or a variety of metrics, right? And so I think that taking co-channel interference into account when you're doing your site survey, I think that there are a couple of assumptions that you can make that are safe to make as long as you document them. One, any existing infrastructure that exists here is probably going to go away. Meaning that when you're doing a site survey and you're doing an AP on a stick and you're taking measurements, anything that's not us is going to show up as noise. Right? Anything that's existing infrastructure, anything that's hotspots or whatever, right? Anything that's, you know, the radiology's APs. I think it's safe for you to assume or declare as an assumption in your deliverables that my noise floor is going to be negligible at ground zero, right? When I do my deployment, it's going to be me and just me. And if it's not me, then my SNR values are probably going to be wrong because your stuff is noise. So that assumption up front, I think, is incredibly important. And then once you've made the assumption about assuming a baseline SNR that's negligible, understanding neighbor relationships and how those neighbor relationships influence transmit power control is going to be very, very important to understanding what the resultant SNR is going to be because, especially we'll use Cisco as an example, they're also going to use noise floor measurements to determine what your power levels are at. So when you do a site survey and you place APA and APB and you place them next to each other, you assume that there's going to be a relationship between those two APs. It's going to influence the cell size of those APs. Cell size of those APs is going to be influenced based on RSSI, SNR, all sorts of stuff, right? That's where in my book you come back to your checksum. If you've done your wireless deployment right, and you settle your APs at power level 3 or so, we can assume, at least in the Cisco world, that SNR has been handled in that calculation. Right? If my APs tank at power level 8, chances are my noise floor is through the roof and chances are it's probably co-channel interference because I've got too dense of a deployment. And so understanding how APs talk to each other and then settle out their power levels based on their neighbor relationships, I think is very, very, very important to understanding that. Simply because the auto RF algorithms that are in place take into account noise floor. And so I think if you have a strong enough understanding about how your manufacturer settles your RF environment, noise floor is one of those things that becomes handled, which is where my checksum approach comes in, right? If your APs are all tanked at a particular power level 8, there's a reason that's happened. Why did that happen? 99% of the time, it's stupid noise floor, stupid co-channel interference, because somebody crammed too many APs together. So understanding those neighbor relationships and checksumming that data with, hey, my network settled at a particular reasonable power level or a particular reasonable RSSI or SNR. It's hard. It's not easy. Not everybody can do it. Those folks that need it right the first time, it's very, very easy to mislead people based on using a survey tool to paint a map green, because there is no representation of what that's ultimately going to look like at the end of the day. I think validating your design post-deployment by one of those metrics, whether they be on-site or off-site, right? As long as you have stated that, and as long as you've set that expectation accordingly up front, I'm going to come and I'm going to sample, and in that sample I'm going to measure RSSI hottest neighbor, RSSI of my second hot neighbor's noise floor, and then I'm going to checksum that with a sane settling of power level on my controller or my deployment. I think that's a perfectly safe way to do it. Is that a fair answer? Okay, is it the right one?
That's a good answer.
Oh, and we're done? No, 3 minutes?
Yeah.
Let's wrap it up. Okay.
I guess to start right at.
Oh, okay. We're done. The end.